So I hear you've built a time machine. Congratulations, that's very good. And you've chosen to travel to medieval England between the 12th and 14th centuries. Excellent choice, of course, but there are some issues you need to think about. The world here is very physical. Lots of people work physically hard. It's quite local as well. Most people don't travel most of the time, and they are suspicious of strangers simply because they don't get many of them. There are fewer people around, so strangers will stand out. That's not a problem because hospitality is a thing. And there are some other issues as well that you need to be aware of. What are they? Well, let's dig into it. The first thing you'll notice is that everything is much more rural. There is genuine wilderness, not so much wilderness like you might get in North America, but there are definitely areas of wildness. People live in tiny hamlets, really. Your average village is going to be about 50 people, which quite frankly today in modern England would be the tiniest of villages, but that's fairly standard. Towns might have 200 people in them. London in the 1100s had about 10,000, maybe 20,000 people. The records are incomplete, but it's not very big at all. The actual number grows in the 1300s to about 100,000, and then the Black Death comes along around the 1350s, 1340s, and kills roughly 30% of the population, and it drops back down to 50,000. But even at the end of the medieval period, London is little more than 120, 130,000. Again, numbers vary. And just to give you an example, that was the biggest city in England, and it was about the same size as modern day Oxford. So by modern standards, quite tiny. There were probably about 2, perhaps 3 million people in the whole of England. So the place will be more or less deserted from a modern day perspective. There are 60 to 70 million people that live here right now. And so 2 or 3 million people spread out amongst small villages is going to be very different. The road network, of course, is very varied. There are some Roman roads which are looked after. There are an awful lot of just rights of way which are going to be muddy tracks in the bad weather. So do not expect road signs, directions. There might be some Roman milestones actually on some of the Roman roads, so there's a vaguest idea of road signs, but not really as we might understand them today. People will just tell you, take that road to go to the next village. They won't really have a bird's eye view perspective of things as we have today. You will probably be told an itinerary. If you want to get to London from where we are now, you take the London road, you get to this next village, you keep going on the London road until you get to London, basically. You won't be nobody will tell you to turn right or turn left at this crossroads or anything like that. That just doesn't exist. That kind of road complexity is not there at all. So the first major kind of social thing you're going to notice is there's hardly anybody about. It is easy to be on your own, but it also means communications are dramatically more difficult. One thing to remember though is that strangers are welcome. There is an obligation, a hospitality obligation at this time of history. You are not expected to be hostile towards strangers. In fact, you are socially obligated to offer them help, especially in some of the religious institutions where obligations to travellers still exist today. You can get what's called the dole. It's a small, usually small glass of a small drink and a small piece of bread, for example. Wayfarer's dole, it's called, still exists. That was completely standard across most ecclesiastical establishments. You go to a monastery or an abbey, they would insist almost on giving you some help. That was a religious obligation. The same happened in towns and villages, but don't overstay your welcome, of course. People will want to hear things you've got to say, but just be cautious because they're also potentially suspicious of strangers. Don't forget the Viking raids aren't that long ago. They're quite a few generations ago, but they're very much part of the social background. The Norman invasions are even more recent, so spies and that kind of thing, they kind of exist and people might be a bit suspicious of it. And don't forget, people have very different views of the world. They may not even understand how big the world is at all. Education is very intermittent. Most people can't read and write well, if at all. Some people in towns can, and having some literacy is not completely unusual. Lots of people think that medieval water was completely contaminated. You couldn't drink it at all and everybody drank ale. Well, the ale drinking is true, but not for the reasons most people think. There was plenty of safe water sources in most towns and villages. Most places had wells. There are often dozens of wells in a town, if not hundreds, quite frankly. Many people had their own well, and as long as it stayed away from cesspits, you're probably going to be okay to drink it. But use your common sense. Anyway, you know, if you're not sure or it smells bad, don't drink it. William Fitzstephen in 1170, I think it was, writing about London, actually compliments London on the number of sweet and good streams in the north in particular. Not sure where in the north, where that would be today, but he was complimentary of the natural good water that might be available. There are obviously polluted water sources, and you have to be careful about the water source as you would be today, but most towns and villages had multiple wells and quite often good streams that you can get good clean water from. But just keep an eye on it as you would anywhere. One of the sources of water that you should be very careful about in the medieval period are big rivers running through towns and cities, especially the major cities. Those are going to be very, very polluted indeed. The runoff from tanneries, which is dog muck and human urine, and the runoff from offal, the shambles, so-called shambles, where animals are slaughtered and the blood just runs into the drain and then into the river, let alone things like fulling shops where the fermented urine is used to make wool cloth become a bit more felted. It allows it to be a bit more matted together. All of those things get run off into the town's river, and then that goes downstream and that's gathered together. So you get to a place like London, and that's towards the mouth of the River Thames, and everything is going to be coming down from all the other places. So the rivers themselves are going to be absolutely filthy. We know that in particular because the Fleet, which is one of the several rivers that run through London, they're all covered over now. They're all pavemented over, but the Fleet until about the 19th century was more or less an open sewer. It was absolutely filthy. It's still there, and the river itself is still there. It's much cleaner than it was, of course, back then, because people don't just put their effluent straight into the thing. But it actually flows out just under Blackfriars Bridge today. But it's covered up, and it's created what's called Fleet Street, which is where all the newspapers used to be. So the newsprint industry used to be centred around a covered over sewer. There are plenty of jokes you could make in that area if you wanted to, of course. But nonetheless, avoid major rivers. They are important navigation centres. That's where all the heavy goods are transported. Everything's transported by river if it possibly can be, because it's much cheaper, much easier, much smoother than going over the terrible roads. You can use the road transports, but rivers are what you want to do. And if you're going to build a castle, you want it to be on a river for defensive purposes too. Don't swim in the rivers either. Try and avoid that. That's not something you want to do. There's a lot of muck in medieval rivers. I'm going to put the candle down, but ale was a common choice for drink. You might be surprised that people drank water in huge quantities, but they also drank ale. Ale was really important. Ale is a form of liquid bread for everybody, quite frankly. They're brewed locally, so most people would have a local alewife. She would be, it's usually she, would be a specialist in making ale. It would be local ale. It wasn't going to keep very long. It was probably not going to be as bitter as you might expect a modern beer to be. Hops came in as a thing towards the end of the medieval period, and were actually quite controversial. There were almost riots about adulteration of beer with hops. It came in from Holland and the Low Countries. It was a sort of trend, and it was seen as a terribly newfangled thing. So the bitter beer that everybody drinks these days was considered to be newfangled and terrible. So ale was brewed locally and drunk locally. It's not going to travel very far. It's not have any preservatives in it whatsoever. There might be some herbs that keep it a bit fresher for a bit longer, but generally speaking, every few days the alewife would be brewing new beer. This is going to be roughly 2-3% proof, so it's like a light beer in terms of alcohol content. Not really designed to get you drunk, although people did get drunk on beer if they drank enough of the ale. It might be flavoured with things like mint and other locally available herbs, or just as it was. And it's going to be slightly cloudy. There was a Venetian chronicler who talks about the ale in London resembling horse piss with lumps in it. Now, he was obviously being a bit negative about London. He was sort of trying to be clever, I suppose, in his TripAdvisor review. But I know that horse urine is actually quite cloudy, sometimes has sort of more grit in it than human urine. Human urine is fairly clear and you can see through it. Horse urine is actually cloudy, so the beer would be cloudy and would probably just have a lot of the bits and bobs. It's not going to be filtered in the same way. It's got lots of bits floating in it, but it's very good for you. And then, as I say, it's liquid bread. It's going to be drunk by children as well. There are no alcohol consumption laws at all at this stage. So as soon as you are capable of drinking, or maybe before then, you would be drinking ale as well as water. Those were the main drinks that were served to anybody. You could find wine. Wine was typically something served in taverns, and typically it was red and sweet and more a noble drink, not really for thirst quenching, and not really, it's more of a feast type of drink, and it's much, much more expensive because almost all of it, not all of it, but almost all of it was imported, so it's terribly expensive. Ale, though, is a fairly easy, fairly cheap drink, so get used to it. Don't forget to compliment your alewife as well. She'll be very pleased to think that you like her ale. A little compliment will go a long way. You might get an extra free serving if she's got a bit left over. Spirits don't really exist at this stage. Distilling alcohol was known, but it was typically a medicinal approach. It was typically not used for drinking. That comes in towards the end of the medieval period, the use of spirits for drink. It was used for various social diseases and as a medicine. It was known about, but it would be extremely unusual to drink it. So just don't ask for a whiskey. There are some places later in Scotland where you might be able to get a whiskey, but that was fairly unusual. And you'll stand out if you even know about spirits being drinkable. Try and time your arrival in the medieval period outside the regular outbreaks of bubonic plague. Bubonic plague still exists on the planet. It still happens, mostly in the third world, but it does sometimes happen in the first world. It is curable. It's curable with modern antibiotics if you catch it early and if it's identified early. Because it's so rare in the Western world, it's often diagnosed quite late. So people do die of it these days, although very rarely. The mortality rate for bubonic plague is about 10%, even now, even with modern medicines. Back then, in the medieval period, especially in massive outbreaks like the so-called Black Death around the 1350s, somewhere between 30 and 50% of the population died. So whole villages were decimated. Villages were abandoned, and half the villagers from one village and half the villagers from another got together in a new village and started again. So well worth avoiding the bubonic plague. And everybody locks down as well. There was no germ theory, of course, so nobody understood bacteria and viruses and transmission, but they did recognise that the more people interacted, the more people got the plague. So a lot of places actually locked down during the bubonic plague, so society and travel collapses for those periods. So if you're travelling during a plague, you're going to get a lot of attention and you're going to get into trouble. People are very scared of plague because it pops up every few decades. Some of it is massively destructive, and other times it's merely dangerous. I mean, COVID is a 1% mortality rate apparently, but the bubonic plague is well over that, so 30 times as many people dying from it. So well worth avoiding that. There's another time period in particular during the anarchy. This was a period where it's called Jesus and his angels slept, because there was absolute chaos everywhere. So avoid civil war in England if you possibly can. There are opportunities to travel during that disruption, but there were a lot of suspicions about spies, and there's a lot of toing and froing, so just avoid it. There's chaos on the roads. The whole justice system collapsed entirely, and people were being murdered and robbed all the time. So just avoid that particular period in history as well. Unless you're particularly adventurous, I suppose, that could be argued that it was quite of an interesting period, but expect to have to run away a lot if you're caught. Travel is going to be one of your difficulties. There's no jumping in a car or a bus or a train or a plane, anything like that. You're going to use one of the major methods of travel in the medieval period. The main method for most people was simply walking. If you're wealthy enough, you could have a horse. You could always catch a ride on the back of a cart, I suppose, to go from a village to a market town, perhaps. A boat is also very useful for transportation, as long as the place you're going is along the river. So boats are very good, especially for long distance travel, crossing the Channel, for example, to go to France. But basically, most people are going to be riding horses or walking. There is some danger to travel in the medieval period. The Statute of Winchester in 1285 talks about clearing the side of the road for 200 feet either side to avoid people ambushing you. Don't think it's that much of a problem, but obviously if there were laws about it, then it was a known issue. Robbery is an occasional thing. You're better to travel in a big group of people, and there are court records from Essex in 1320 talking about groups of men lying wait on the King's Highway and ambushing them. So it was known about. It existed. It wasn't particularly common, though, I don't think, and especially if you're traveling in a group of people, which is typically how people traveled in these days. They traveled from an inn to another inn, or from an inn to a town to another town. You'd be traveling with a big group of people. Most people are armed, not with swords as such or with war weapons, but most people are carrying a fairly stout blade, just a working knife, and a quarterstaff or a walking staff actually can be quite a useful weapon too. You're not going to be wearing armour, though. Typically you're not going to be having swords or polearms with you unless you are military. It is completely possible, of course, to hire guards like that. If you are a bishop and you're travelling to foreign lands, then you will have an entourage with you, and you may well have armed guards in armour, breastplates, mail, helmets, and weapons of war, including longbowmen and that kind of thing. Travelling is not unusual in the medieval period. Most people don't travel much, but some people travel for thousands of miles on foot to go on pilgrimage. Many people, at least once in their lifetime, will go on a pilgrimage. So you will have hundreds, if not thousands, of people travelling quite long distances all the time, especially in the good weather. But you've also got market traders, you've got drovers moving herds of animals down the drovers' routes. So you will have an infrastructure that is designed to accommodate travellers, but just don't expect to get into log jams or difficulty in the same way. You will see people on the roads, but you're not going to see many people, and expect to exchange stories with them and chat and find out where they're going and where you're going. If something does happen, don't expect to be able to call the police. There are no police. There's no such thing at all. Although every local man is supposed to join what's called the hue and cry. This is a cry that goes up, and every man is supposed to stop what he's doing and join in the suppression of badness that's going on, or try and catch the robber. So hue and cry does exist. It's a fairly simple mechanism designed to grab them all together and, for example, apprehend a robber or a murderer or whatever it might be. Pretty chaotic, though, and I'm sure some people didn't actually get involved in that kind of thing, but there are going to be no police around at all, so you're going to have to take care of yourself very much. Money is going to be a big issue. England runs on silver pennies. Silver is the material of choice. From Offa in the 8th century all the way through to Edward III, silver pennies are the coin that is going to be used for any normal, ordinary transaction. There are gold coins, there are shillings and pounds, but those are more accountancy reckoning, and they will be for big purchases, or if you want to build a castle or buy an inn or something like that. You won't buy it in pennies, you'll buy it in pounds and shillings. Most people will rarely have seen a shilling, almost certainly never seen a gold coin. They can't even work out what a gold coin is worth. So don't go in with gold coins, just go in with silver pennies. It's the weight of the silver that's important. At some periods in the medieval, particularly in the Viking, in the Danelaw and in Viking settled territories, hack silver, the pure weight of silver, whatever it looks like, it's the weight of silver that matters, not the denomination on it. Be a little careful in later periods about the debasement of the silver, because pure silver is worth a certain amount. The Royal Mint proceeds to, as you might imagine, debase the coin. And what that means is mixing the pure silver with a base metal and calling it pure silver. Everybody gets the hang of that and goes, hang on, this isn't worth as much. You start to get inflation, you start to get debasement of the coins. The coins are less trusted, takes more of them to order, more of them to buy the same kind of material. So that happens very slowly, though. It happens over lifetimes generally. And try and keep an eye on sweated or clipped coins as well. They're still legal tender, but if they're too obviously bits clipped off the sides or too obviously worn, you sweat coins by putting them in a bag and shaking them a lot. All the little bits wear off, and you can then make another silver coin that way. Keep an eye on the quality of the coin as well. If you possibly can, don't take bad quality coins, because other people might just reject them. There is very little way of checking and guaranteeing the quality of the coins, though. So just follow your instincts. If it looks a bit dodgy, just don't accept it. There is a technique that I thought was really interesting. There was a bishop who was travelling from England to the continent. I presume might be travelling to Rome, for example. He wasn't sure about coinage as well. So what he did is just take a big bar of silver, pure silver, and everywhere he went that he was staying for any length of time, he went to the local mint and gave them some silver and said, make me some coins, please, in your local currency. I presume if he didn't use all of them, he'd melt them down again in the next place. But I thought that was quite a clever idea. The actual solid bar of silver would be turned into coins for his use in that local area. When you travel, you're going to need to stay somewhere. It is frowned upon to sleep outdoors, really. You might be done for vagrancy, and it's just not really, I mean, you could get away with it, I'm sure, but it isn't the thing that's done. Most people walk from town to town or village to village. They stay in the local village. Hospitality is very well accepted. In villages, everybody will notice you immediately. You will be the stranger. You'll be the talk of the village, and it'll be unusual. They'll wonder what you're doing, but you will find a place to stay. People will offer you a place in a barn for very little money at all. They may even offer you their own bed for a bit more coin. They'll sleep on the floor because coin is very valuable. And they're happy to take coin from you. And they will ask you questions, of course. They want to know all about you. If you go to the bigger towns, certainly the cities, especially a town with a market charter, they will almost certainly have an inn. And that's a custom designed place for travellers. That's going to be much more normal to have strangers there. Local villages will have strangers, but that'll be fairly unusual. An inn is going to be regularly used by strangers. Some of them will be regular travellers. They'll know the inn well because they're on a market route, they're on a particular trade route. Others will just be new people. So lots of people will be chatting. You can stay in the Great Hall, just find a corner and sleep there. That's going to be noisy, rowdy, but probably a bit warmer than other places. The innkeeper will, of course, likely have a series of private rooms, maybe 1 or 2 private rooms if you want to spend more money, a couple of silver pennies perhaps for a decent room. He'll be happy to take your money because after all it's a business, and that's what he's hoping to do. He'll sell you food, there'll be some entertainment perhaps, and then you'll be expected to go on your way. Travellers will be there, and a lot of business people will be there. There may even be literally spies. There may be foreign agents trying to find out what's going on. There may be people asking about who you passed on the way. Did you pass any soldiers? Is anything brewing? What are the rumours from the north? What are the rumours from the south? So keep your wits about you, and remember, people aren't stupid, but they're not particularly well educated in the way we might say today. Don't come up with any outlandish stories unless you're actually a storyteller and you're just pretending to make things up, because made up stories are delightful for people. But don't go and talk about faraway places like Australia. And mind you, I suppose you could. They'll just assume you're talking nonsense and you're a stranger with strange tales. So perhaps you can do. One of the areas that pilgrims in particular stay in are not inns as such, although they would have had accommodation for pilgrims, but religious establishments, so abbeys and monasteries. They often had very specific facilities for religious travellers in particular, but not always religious travellers. So you can go and stay there. They're a bit more austere and perhaps safer, I don't know, less interesting than staying in an inn, but you may feel safer there. They often segregate men and women too, and they may require you not to talk too much during dinner because they'll be reading out prayers. Some of the monks may be interested in talking, but check the local rules because sometimes they're not expected to talk too much, and particularly not have idle chatter as well. Idle chatter was considered to be not a sin as such, but it was frowned upon. So idle chit chat at dinner is not to be pursued, but maybe asking about principles of theology or what they believe, they may be really excited to talk about that. Possibly even things like philosophy. So gen up on your ancient philosophers, because of course Plato and Aristotle, known today, were known then. So if you have a little bit of a classical education, that could come in useful. The Latin is going to be quite odd, though you might not recognise it if you're an Italian speaker, for example. The way that the English monasteries spoke Latin will be very unfamiliar to you and quite odd. And there is a thing called cod Latin as well, sort of effectively dodgy, slightly very grammatically incorrect Latin that sounds like Latin as far as pretty much anybody else is concerned. So cod Latin was a thing, so not pretending to speak in Latin, but Latinized version, slightly faking it, was actually something that happened as well. We can see that from the written records. Some of the written records are done in quite bad Latin. But I guess if that's all you know, that's better than no Latin at all. What kind of food are you going to eat? Well, if you are travelling as a modest person, if you're, let's say, a pilgrim or a merchant and you're not travelling as somebody wealthy, you're going to have fairly plain food. There's a lot of boiled food. You're going to have mostly vegetarian food unless you're very lucky or it's a feast day. So it's going to be a lot of pottage. It's going to be legumes, onions, things like turnips, peas, beans, boiled up, basically. You might have a little bit of rabbit, or unlikely to be chicken. You might have a bit of rabbit, a bit of fish, depending on the time of year. If you get very friendly, you might get some poached venison, perhaps, but I wouldn't expect as a stranger you'll be allowed to see that being eaten, if they even have it, because that can be quite a serious crime depending on where you are and the location and the time in history. But poaching, I'm sure, happened, but as a stranger, unless you become very familiar with the local people, they're not going to show you that. Pottage is what it's going to be: apples, cheese, bread. Heavy rye bread was very common. That lasts a long time. Wheat bread is more expensive, but still available probably, but you're going to be paying more for it. There are street foods like peas cod, which is a form of deep fried peas. There are going to be pasties, especially in towns and places like London. There is a bit of a tourist trade, so you are going to have street food. So there will be interesting foods to eat. The hygiene will be variable for those foods, though. So if you go to a cook shop, you're likely to have more decent food. You can get pies, pasties, bread, all sorts of things. But you will go to a specific shop for a specific type of food. So enjoy the different meals. And it's going to be street food. You're going to be walking around trying food from this place and this place. You can bring your own food to a cook shop. So you can take your own pie fillings and somebody will cook a pie for you. I wouldn't suggest, unless you know them particularly well, to do that. But it is possible. You could take some filling and ask them to put it in a pie and then eat the pie as you travel. But there will be ordinary food, and typically pies cost a penny or 2 pennies. There are big ones and small ones. There are various ordinances about quality of pies and quality of food for poor people. So there's an awareness of social status and quality of food. There are laws about serving stinking food and food with parsley garnish and things like that. But generally speaking, the food will be hearty but relatively plain. Spices are available, but they're expensive. So you pay more for cinnamon, you'll pay a lot more for pepper. These things are not uncommon, but they are at the more expensive end of the street food. But you will have things like mustard and to a certain extent garlic, depending on where you are. But mustard and onions in particular are very common forms of flavouring for cheaper food. There is, of course, no potato and no tomato and no tobacco. Those are going to be noticeably missing, especially if you're used to pizza or you're used to chips or anything like that. You have turnips and you have swedes and you have all sorts of mangels and root vegetables, carrots in particular, but no potatoes whatsoever. They come from the New World. Same with tobacco. Same with some kind of beans as well. People are confused. People think beans come from the New World. Some of them do, but there were European style beans, English beans that are native to Europe as well. So all sorts of beans aren't there either. And tobacco, no tobacco smoke, but there will be lots of wood smoke around. So nobody's going to be smoking pipes in the medieval period. That comes in much later. And sadly, for many of you, no coffee. There will be tea, but tea is going to be very expensive and exotic because that comes from China and will be very expensive. So I would not expect to actually have tea unless you go to a very expensive establishment. And certainly no coffee. Strangely though, coffee did exist. It does exist in the Arab world, but it doesn't seem to have come over to England, let alone Western or Northern Europe at all at this stage. So it is possible to have encountered coffee, theoretically, but nobody would really understand what it was and they wouldn't really know how to prepare it either. So if you encountered it, an exotic merchant maybe would have some coffee beans, and maybe you could teach people how to drink coffee. There's a thought. The language spoken in England is going to be very variable. It will be a form of English, but it will be very hard for you to understand if you speak modern English. There are accents today, and some of them are very strong, and it takes me a little bit of time to adjust to the accent. Take that and multiply it by 10. The accent's going to change from one village and one district to the next, and they are going to be curious as to your accent and the words you use as well, and the rhythms. You will also, in the 12th and 13th century, if you're speaking to somebody wealthy or noble, they are going to speak a form of French. It won't be French that would be easily understood by modern French speakers either, because it's a form of Norman French, and even at the time Norman French was considered to be a rough and ready and crude form of the French spoken in the Ile-de-France by the French. So Norman French is the language spoken by the aristocracy and the nobility in their own little social groups. Many of the younger generation, though, will also be bilingual. They're often brought up by wet nurses, they have friends and relations, so they need to speak to the ordinary people. So a lot of the nobility by the 13th century, certainly the 14th century, are all speaking English as well. And pretty much English is the lingua franca of England at the 14th century and on and beyond. Some people still spoke a little bit of French, really for pretentious purposes, and Latin was still used for legal documents, and Norman French is still used for some legal documents and legal phrases that are not in common use, but in very specific niche areas of language. So at the beginning of the medieval period, at the beginning of the 12th century, having some idea of Norman French is probably a good idea. I wouldn't worry too much. It's going to be a tiny number of people that speak it. And if you do encounter somebody who's noble, they'll probably have translators with them as well, so they'll be able to speak English of a form to you. Younger generation is bilingual, and then 14th century Chaucer is writing in English, a form of English which is recognisable, especially when spoken out loud. Spelling is phonetic, so a lot of the odd spellings we have in written English today are based on the way words would be spoken. So if there's an E on the end of the word, it is going to be actually sounded out. So ye old shop is actually the Y is not a Y, it's a thorn, it's a new, not a new, it's an old letter that's not used anymore. It's a Y with a cross through it, with a bar through it. It actually sounds like the. So it's the old shopper. I'm doing it badly. There are experts who can do the language better, but there are lots more sounds in older English than there is today. So it's the older shopper. Your accent, though, will be best disguised by saying you're a pilgrim or a traveller from a foreign land. Everybody's fine with that. That's acceptable. It's perfectly normal. And so having a funny accent, you just put it down to being a foreigner and everybody will be fine and they will try to communicate. If you have a little bit of Latin, that's possibly quite useful if you're speaking to the religious institute. You can almost prove that you're clergy by speaking some Latin. And so in a way, if you needed social proof you're a pilgrim, or maybe your cover story is that you are foreign clergy and you speak a bit of Latin, that's probably sufficient to convince other people that you are actually a member of a religious order. Who should you pretend to be? Well, I think it's been pretty obvious to me that the two descriptions of travellers that would work best if you're a time traveller would be pilgrim, especially a pilgrim from foreign lands who's going to Canterbury. Make sure you know roughly which direction the pilgrimage sites are in England. Canterbury is a good one. Hereford Cathedral, any cathedral you can think of that still exists would have potential pilgrimage value. So you could just name a cathedral, an old cathedral, obviously not a new one, but name an old cathedral and say you're travelling there, and they'll point you in the right direction. And a merchant. A merchant would be another good one, especially a foreign merchant, maybe a journeyman, maybe somebody who is looking for business for his master, who has a shipping company and is looking to sell wool or buy wool or any of these kind of things. Wine, wool, cloth, these are all regularly traded. Spices too. Spices could be good. I wouldn't pretend to be a craftsperson, a mason or a blacksmith, unless you have those skills, because you may get called to help out, and it would look a bit fishy if you actually didn't know which end of a hammer was which, or how to use a chisel, and you didn't know the terms of art of those places. But a merchant would be a good one, and a pilgrim would be another good cover story. Then your accent, your slightly odd mannerisms, your unusual clothes, all absolutely fine. Should you pretend to be a member of the nobility? If you want to have fun, yes, but remember the nobility are a very, very tiny fraction of society, probably less than 1%. They have their own network as well, so they might know somebody who knows somebody, and they will ask you leading questions about where you're from and who's your father and all that kind of stuff you might not be able to answer very well. I guess you could get away with pretending to be nobility from the Low Countries, from the Holy Roman Empire or something like that, but even then it's a bit risky. They might know somebody who knows somebody who's never heard of you. So be a bit cautious. We do actually know there are court cases about people being prosecuted for presenting themselves as false squires. So they were obviously pretending to be more noble than they actually were, and they got fined, or in some cases exiled for it, but very rarely. Usually it's a fine and punishment. So be a bit cautious with the whole noble thing. You're much better off as a pilgrim or a merchant, to be honest. How you dress will also indicate to people on first glance who you are. So try to wear the clothes and the cloth that would be appropriate for your status. If you're wearing expensive silks, people are going to assume you're wealthy, and you're going to have to behave as if you're wealthy. So it's better off to stick to wool. The quality of the wool will be recognised, the colour of the wool as well. So bright colours are liked, but they're more expensive than more washed out colours. So the sort of paler the colour, generally speaking, blues are certain types of blue are fairly cheap. Certain types of blue are more expensive. So there's a lot of subtlety in it. But best to have slightly subdued colours, not browns necessarily. You can go for blues and browns and yellows, and pink is a colour that isn't associated with femininity at all. There are many men that wear pink in the medieval period. Pink and blue are swapped over, I think, in the Victorian period, where pink used to be a male colour and blue used to be a female colour. But I don't think they're particularly colour focused in that way in the medieval period. So try and have reasonable quality wool, keeps you warm. It's what most people are wearing. But don't go for colours like black. That is very expensive. That will mark you out as somebody who is wealthy. I mean, I suppose if you want to be seen as wealthy, fair enough. But black requires a lot of dye, and therefore to get a black that's half decent, especially a modern black, is very, very unusual. Blacks usually tinged with usually browns or blues as well. They over dye lots of times. That damages the cloth and takes up a lot of dye, and therefore blacks and dark colours are very, very wealthy. Silks are available, but again at the higher end. So if you're wearing silk, you are going to be thought of as very, very wealthy. There are sumptuary laws, there are rules about what you should wear for certain types of status. Those are widely ignored, though. Nobody really bothers about it. So if you're not being too presumptuous and not flaunting your wealth, you can get away with wearing more or less anything. But be a bit careful, because you will stand out. Obviously, no unusual modern materials. Nylon is completely unknown. Many synthetic types of cloth are almost unknown. Stretchy cloth is relatively unknown, although hose can be cut on the bias, so you do get stretchiness with certain types of wool. So stretchy, clingy clothes are suitable, but usually for men and usually for their leg coverings in particular. In the later medieval period, you do get very waisted clothing that shapes the male form to create this hourglass. The hourglass form for men is much sought after, and you get ridiculously pointy shoes as well, shown in court records. But again, I think those are more for fancy pants kind of courts and the realm of kings, and I would avoid that, because it's just going to be tricky. It's going to be difficult to get involved with royalty in any way, shape or form. Most people will know that the world is a fairly big place. The world being a globe is, it's probably not common knowledge, but it's not unusual to know that the world is a globe. That was known from quite an early period. Goes back to the ancients. People think of, in England anyway, people think of France as fairly exotic. Don't forget, we've been at war with France a lot, so probably best not to talk about the French too much. Might be misunderstood. But you could talk about the Low Countries, Belgium, Holland, the Holy Roman Empire, Scandinavia as well. All of the northern European areas are probably safe to talk about. If you start to go further afield, if you start to get to Italy, that's also known about. A lot of the fashion comes from Italy. So if you're wearing fashion that's too advanced, maybe it's 50 years advanced, your shoes are too pointed or your doublets not quite right for the period, you could say you're from Italy, because Italy was the source of fashion, and it travels north and west, and people catch on to Italian fashions 20 years later in the English court, for example. So if you've got fancy fashion and it stands out, you always say you've been traveling in Italy, perhaps. If you go further that, you get to the Middle East. Jerusalem is well known as a holy place, though it's a place of pilgrimage. Once you get to Jerusalem, Venice is known, but once you get to Jerusalem and beyond, it starts to verge into semi-legendary status. China is known about, but many people will think of it. The Silk Road, the Silk Route, spices come from the Far East. It starts to get semi-legendary. People talk about single-footed men and horned beasts, and all sorts of weird things go with it. It is known about, but it becomes legendary. So certainly don't talk about places like Australia. Don't forget the Americas are unknown to Europeans at this stage, possibly. There are some thoughts that in the later medieval period, people are aware of it, and the Vikings potentially settled in north of North America, up in Newfoundland and Canada. So it's not impossible that would be known about, but it's probably best, if you're talking to ordinary people, to stick to Western Europe, Northern Europe as subjects to talk about. You can mention exotic places like Cathay, or far away Indonesia, and where the spices come from, but in a very throwaway place. They won't expect you to know where they are or what they look like or what they speak there. So be a bit cautious there. And certainly don't talk about flight, helicopters, jet engines, rockets, or anything like that. You could perhaps have modern technology if you pretended it was something exotic. So if you had your phone, your smartphone, for example, if you had it wrapped up in a leather case, and if you kept it hidden, obviously the light would be a bit of a giveaway, but if you kept it hidden, people might think it was something religious. You could possibly disguise modern technology as a religious object of worship. There are the reliquaries that look pretty impressive, so you might want to say, don't touch this, this is the bones of some saint, so it's not for you to touch, but it is my stuff. You could perhaps hide it that way. I think it's a lot better to not actually bring anything there that might draw attention. There's not really the concept of witchcraft. You're not going to get burnt as a witch if you have the high tech, but sorcery, people were occasionally prosecuted for sorcery. There's no such thing as burning at the stake. That comes in much later in the 16th century, in the Puritans. There are punishments like burning at the stake and hanging, drawing and quartering, but they are for the most severe crimes, usually against the king. So just don't get involved in insurrection against the king, because punishments are quite bad. But you will not likely be accused of being a witch in the medieval period. That comes in much later with the Reformation of the Church and the Puritans. The place is entirely, well, England is majority Catholic. There is one Christian church, it's the Catholic Church. There will be the Jews there. There will also be foreign travellers as well. So you're going to have Muslims, Muslim men with different coloured skin as well, particularly in port towns. So places like London or Bristol, where you're going to get a lot of travel. You're going to see fewer people with dark skin the further north you go, the further away from the south coast of England you get. But they are known about. They will be unusual, but they're not particularly unusual. Nobody's going to be worried about you. They will just recognise that you're from Africa or from somewhere far away. So your cover story, being a pilgrim or being a merchant, will be fine for that. There is very little over racism at this time. So people with different coloured skin other than white, pale skin of Northern Europeans, they're not thought of as bad. They are just thought of as different. There are obviously aspects of the Muslim invasions in Spain and places like that, but that's some time ago, and therefore sort of ancient history, especially for England and northern France in particular, that's not really known about, so you don't have to worry about that at all. There were even more exotic people. So, for example, we know Matthew Paris writes about Mongol envoys as well coming from Mongolia. So it is entirely possible that you will meet Chinese people and Mongol people, but they're very rare. They're very rare, very notable. But you might be rare and notable for other people too. So if you're not from England, there's no reason why you can't claim to be a Mongol, claim to be from China, anything like that, especially if you're being friendly and maybe bringing trade or the possibility of trade. What about your arrival strategy? Where should you turn up? Well, it's probably best not to turn up at dawn in a village somewhere. They're going to get really worried about that, because where have you come from? How have you got there? All that kind of stuff. You could sort of emerge in areas of wilderness or areas of forest. Those are much more like wilderness, but again, why wander from a place like that where you don't need to? I would suggest you turn up in a busy port. They're going to have foreigners all the time. They're going to have strangers coming and going. There's all sorts of things going on. There are accommodations for foreigners. People saying, how do I get to London from Bristol? People point you in the right direction. None of that will be unusual. So if you turn up in a port as a stranger who doesn't understand the customs properly, is a bit sort of nervous about where they are, that's completely acceptable in places like London, Bristol, any of the Cinque ports, the trade ports on the south coast and the south and east coast in particular. Even places on the west coast of England, you would be expected to have foreigners. So coastal positions are probably the ideal place to emerge, especially if you're not quite polished or you're not quite sure what your story is. But get your story sorted out. People are used to tall tales, of course, but I would suggest you keep your story fairly grounded, at least initially, until you get the flow of talking. And then maybe you want to exaggerate the stories and tell tales, but be a little cautious, don't get carried away. Lastly, my advice for you as a time traveller is to immerse yourself in medieval England. It's not that dangerous. There are not that many people around. If you are friendly, people will be friendly back. Be cautious of local customs, but you're not going to get yourself into big trouble if you're just decent and behave reasonably well. People accommodate strangers. That's part of society. So enjoy yourself and come back and tell us all about it.